Um, Hi y'all. So if y'all know, we've done something a lot recently where we've tried to teach y'all how to properly use sourcing in your speeches. But because I think it's one of the most important things that you'll learn as an extemper is how to properly use and read sources. We decided to do a presentation on it. So yeah, I like to title this "How to Actually Do the News" because sometimes it's really hard to tell when you can and can't use a source. So yeah, research and sourcing are extremely important because you want to come across as unbiased as possible in your speeches. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's definitely one of the things that a judge can judge you very harshly on. So, research before the tournament. You want most of your research you read before tournament to be unbiased sources. You just want to be able to bring up evidence that you know from previous reading in your free time without it being wrong or misleading, because you want to be able to use that information in your speeches. Because a lot of extemp is mostly thinking on your feet. You want to be able to kind of catalog that information in your brain, like statistics and names and stuff, without the information being wrong. And on top of that, because you end up using that information in your sources, you kind of have to be reading the news every single day. Now, it does tend to sound a little overwhelming to some people, but to me, as like a senior on the team, it's something that I've been doing for 4 years, and now I'm just like genuinely interested in what's happening in our country. So yeah, a lot of extemp in Congress is being able to remember and bring forward facts without having to spend a lot of extra prep time researching for those facts. We really only get 15 minutes of prep time and 15 minutes of memorizing a speech, and you only want to spend you want to spend as little time as possible actually researching for that speech. Like, I've gotten my research time down to 10 minutes because I know so many previous facts without actually having to look them up and reading through articles. So, a trick that I use very often and researching the news every single day and reading it is I like to go to the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, and I like to look at the top news articles that either happen in the world or just our country and have been written throughout the entire day. This is often the way, as Carter has brought up a lot of times, is the way that schools write their extemp questions. I know that we did that last year. You just kind of scroll through and see what's the most current and then write questions about that. And since schools do that so often, it's also the best tactic to prep for tournaments. So yeah, basically researching for a tournament, you have to research for a tournament. It's basically like writing a case for debate, but instead you're just reading the news for extemp and Congress. So, researching slash sourcing at the tournament and your speeches. Sourcing is by far one of the most important aspects of your speeches. The judge has to know that you're not just making up information, and instead you actually have facts to back up what you're saying. If I just say that Trump lied yesterday and have no source, no information, and they don't even know what Trump lied about, and I could just be making it up, they have no reason to trust what I'm saying. I'm just a random high schooler who didn't actually do any research. But if I say that the Washington Post said on November 27th of 2018 that Trump lied about how many illegal immigrants were in the country, then they know that's a tangible fact that actually proves what I'm saying. Um, and in a speech, you should not only say the name of your source, but also the date in which it's produced. I, as a freshman, tended to just say the month and the year. So I would say written in May of 2019. I would say that that's tends to be okay as long as you're a novice. Once you get to varsity extemp, you kind of have to say the exact date, just because a lot of varsity extemp is speaking on topics that are currently happening. So the like closer the source is to your speech time, the better. So a lot actually of my sources were just written the day before in DX, just because DX is our own country. So a lot of the sources are most recent. And then also you really do have to say like the date it was produced. I've had judges write on my ballot, like if I accidentally forgot to say the date, which can sometimes happen, they were like date question mark. So judges do know that they're supposed to be there. So I highly recommend training yourself to do that. Also, in your speech, it's extremely important to use unbiased sources. The judge has to be able to trust you no matter what political party they align with. And sometimes they do put their political opinion into their judging. And the quickest way to do that is to use an unbiased source. Now, I will preface the fact that no source is truly unbiased. And I think it's okay to admit that, just because even as I try to use extremely unbiased sources, in the reality, no source is actually truly unbiased, and there are no real middle of the ground sources. But we do try to use the most unbiased sources as possible. A judge really can't, or they shouldn't be able to tell your political opinion from your speech. And in turn, you shouldn't use biased sources that align with your political party just because they're what you're used to reading. So, on top of that, something that I know we've taught our freshmen in the past, and I think it's really helpful, is how to tell if the source is actually reliable. So yeah, just trying to tell what their bias is. This is a media bias chart that I've used in previous years, and I think it really helps quantify the bias of sources. So you'll see that so the left is obviously liberal and the right is conservative, and you will see kind of the sources that you know are biased. So CNN is obviously very left. They're put in the middle of this chart just because I think this chart was made a couple of years ago. Actually, just kidding, it was made in 2019, but that's wrong. CNN should be way farther on left, because CNN and Fox are both left and right bias sources. We don't typically use MSNBC. We don't use let's see what else is there. We don't use the Inquirer. We don't use InfoWars. We don't use Breitbart. Anything that we know to be a left and right source, we don't ever use, just because once again we have to be as unbiased as possible. We also try to stay away from sources that aren't necessarily right or left, but are just known to be untruthful. Some of those examples are Vanity Fair, the Daily Mail. There are some other ones on here that are kind of like that. Typically, you won't ever actually have to use them because they're not really the ones that pop up first. But there's just no point in using an unreliable source when you have reliable ones at your disposal, especially with the internet. A judge will just trust you better if you say, the New York Times said this, rather than the Daily Mail. So yeah, feel free to search up this chart if you guys think it's helpful. I know I've actually used it a couple of times just to see what a source was. So yeah, don't use biased sources. Please, please don't use them. Sources like CNN or Fox are almost absolutely never okay to use. CNN can be used for statistics. They're known for doing really good polls, but never for opinions. It'll make you seem a lot more unreliable in your speech, or more overall just decrease the quality of your speech. The best sources that to use are those that are seemingly extremely unbiased. Sources like NPR is one that we love to use. Washington Post, New York Times are the three best sources to use. Also, for international extent, countries local newspapers are typically unreliable. Try using Al Jazeera or the Economic Times. I don't know, talk to Elijah and Carter, and they'll probably have more of these sources. I just only really know our country's ones because I only really do DX. So yeah, use a reliable source. If a source is sketchy, don't use it. Sketchy, as I like to call them, sources will either use sensational words or absolutes. Surprising news. You have to read this. What everyone is talking about. Basically, clearly over-exaggerating what the article actually is. Here's what a perfectly balanced week of workouts look like. That is clearly over-exaggerated and just unreliable. So also, if the source uses shocking facts, they will try, and a term that's used a lot with YouTubers is clickbaiting people. These articles may use new and shocking and crazy facts in the title. Because you should read the news every day, you should be able to label those facts as false. If you choose to either make the source or this a fact in your speech, it can make you seem a lot less trustworthy to judge. So Ebola, the ISIS of biological agents, question mark. That is absolute clickbait. To call something ISIS is clearly appealing to the emotional part of the US just because like terrorism is clearly emotional for America. And so they're trying to appeal to like the emotions of their audience. And so that's very clickbaity. And then the president gets 2 scoops of ice cream. Everyone else won. What does that even mean, CNN? What does that even mean? No one really knows. So yeah, CNN, I would say CNN and Fox, if you look at some of their news titles online, they're actually kind of really funny. So then a reliable author, I don't typically do this. I know some Congress people tend to do this more than Extemp especially, but true reliable sources should have an author listed in the article. If you read the news a lot, you get to know the names that pop up again and again that are reliable, than those that aren't. For determining if a source is reliable, you can look up the author and see their credentials. If they are reliable, but the source isn't, you can just name them instead of the source. You don't really do this in Extemp just because I have a hard enough time just naming a source, let alone the author of the source. But I know in Congress, this can be really helpful. And then government websites. A government website is really handy to use if you need quick facts and often a way to prove your claim. I often use that for population statistics of a city or for the FDA's research on drugs. You can immediately trust these numbers and you can quote a government agency, which seems very official. I don't like using them for impacts, especially because a government agency's website should be really like not emotional at all. It should be very like statistical. But I would say for like your first like part of your speech, using this for like a first source just to prove what you're saying is true is honestly really helpful, especially right now with the coronavirus. The FDA has released some really cool and interesting papers over different types, over like the different number of deaths in different states, which states are increasing, which states are decreasing. Also, drug trials are really interesting right now. So yeah, government websites can be really helpful. And why does this even matter? So the trick is that a judge has to trust you in order to vote your speech up. If your speech and your sources aren't reliable, then they're a lot less likely to vote you up. And if you don't use sources at all, or you like don't use the date, the judge likely won't believe you, especially if the facts are kind of harder to believe. And this is also kind of true for FX more than DX, I would say. If your facts are harder to believe, then if your facts are harder to believe, then I would just say try to use as reliable sources as possible. And yeah, feel free to email or text a group me if you guys have any questions.